You're listening to Season 5 of the Devoted Dreamers podcast. Welcome, Dreamer. I'm so glad you're here. I'm your host, Merritt Ansa, and this is the podcast where we talk about our God-shaped dreams, the ones we're pursuing, hoping to pursue, or waiting on God to reveal. I don't know you yet, but I hope to, and my hope with this podcast is to help you move from uncertainty to action so that your life might sing, that it might sing praises to God for your good and His glory, because He made you for big things. But the more I talk with women about their dreams, the more I understand there's a battle within. Is it okay to be ambitious, to dream, to do something with our skills, gifts, and experiences? If you're struggling with this, don't listen to me. Go read God's Word, specifically Ephesians 1, and let the God of the universe remind you that you were chosen for a purpose, in order that you might live for the praise of His glory. Sure, you might feel some fear, anxiety, insecurity walking forward in your dream, but don't let those things stop you. We all feel them to some extent, and you cannot let those feelings, or the voices that tell you you have no business dreaming this dream, you cannot let them win, because you are a daughter of the King. And that's why we're having this conversation. I pray it's what you hear today in this episode. Thank you so much for joining in. As always, you'll find the show notes at merrittansa.com/podcast. And please connect with me and the community of Devoted Dreamers in our Facebook group or over on Instagram at merrittjo. And now, here's today's episode. Hello, Devoted Dreamers, and welcome back to the Devoted Dreamers podcast. I am Merritt Ansa, if you didn't already know that, and I am back today from maternity leave, and it ended up being slightly longer than expected, but I'm so grateful to be back at it and talking today with Megan Sjuts for episode 95. Megan, I believe I found you on Instagram somewhere. Something about your feed or your stories just really drew me in. But for you listening out there, if you don't know Megan Sjuts, she is the founder of Building 7, a newly rebranded, relaunched graphic design and web design business. And she's going to tell us a little bit about that story. But obviously a small business owner. She's also an instructor at a local community college. She is married to Elliot and a mama to Chocolate Lab and 4 chickens. That was my favorite part of your intro. 4 chickens. So Megan, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's dig right into it. Will you talk about your God-shaped dream?
Yeah. I mean, you kind of covered, a little bit of it. So I recently just relaunched my graphic design business as Building 7. And so I don't know if any of your listeners maybe know who I am or have followed along with me the last few years. But prior to Building 7, my freelancing business was called Megan Nicole Media. And so I started my design journey, I guess, back in 2014, 2015. And just kind of started freelancing on the side. I was working full time during that season of my life in an office and just kind of doing like an office admin job while I was also in grad school, and then just kind of started freelancing on the side. And that's kind of how I got started, I guess, in design. And so I'm originally from Florida. So I was living in Florida, and my husband now, at the time, was in Oregon. And so after we got married, I moved out here and kind of transitioned full time into design. So then I was still under Megan Nicole Media for about 2 years after I moved to Oregon, and was just kind of getting used to transitioning into that role full time and focusing on my business. And then at the beginning of this year, I started teaching some graphic design courses, like you mentioned, at a local community college here in Oregon. And that's just been an amazing experience, and kind of was a little bit of a catalyst, I guess. It kind of pushed me into the transition of building 7, and just wanting to kind of expand my business into, other areas, including education. And so that's kind of, I guess, the short story of how I got to launching Building 7 in August. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. And I offer kind of a full range of graphic and web design services under Building 7 right now.
And I'm curious, which was harder, starting your business and like quitting your full-time job, or beginning the teaching role? Because I think those both have some unique challenges to them.
Well, I would say probably the teaching was maybe harder, just because my transition into doing design full-time really just happened pretty organically. I mean, I was already in transition with, getting married, and then I moved from Florida to Oregon. And so I kind of landed here, with nothing other than my design work kind of in place. And so I just sort of naturally and organically transitioned into that full time. And then I was also just kind of in a place of being open to other possibilities, whether that be like a job or teaching had been something that had kind of been, I guess, on the back of my mind while I was in grad school. And so I finished grad school and graduated at the end of last year, so December of 2017. And then transitioned immediately into teaching January of 2018. And so I feel like for me, those transitions have obviously been orchestrated by God, but just everything, it's funny how you transition out of one thing and directly into another. And so I think in both of those cases, it really just was him, directing my steps and making, opening those doors for me to walk through at the right time.
I noticed from some of what you shared with me before our call that you kind of fell into design, like it wasn't something that you set out to do or even really a career that you knew about before.
Yeah, so I think I shared with you in undergrad, I majored in advertising and marketing. And then after I graduated, I worked for a brief amount of time, kind of in the role that I saw myself being in, I guess, after I graduated, or like the idea of what I thought I wanted to do, which was working in kind of the traditional sense in the advertising industry of like working for an agency and kind of being in that setting. And I learned really quickly that it wasn't what I expected it to be, or at least my personal experience. And it wasn't what I expected it to be. And it wasn't anything that I really wanted to be a part of in the experience that I had. And so I think that kind of led me to questioning, okay, like I know that I've always loved the creative side of advertising and like the creative execution of ad campaigns and that side of it. So that I think that kind of led me towards design without even really realizing or really understanding what graphic design was. And it wasn't, anything that I was super intentional, I guess, early on about pursuing. Cause like you said, I didn't really know that it was like a career path or like something that was, actually, like an industry that I would be interested in, I guess. And so just kind of, it's funny, like looking back, I can see where I kind of like bumped into graphic design or like was so close to it without even really knowing that that's what it was. And so when I started researching, I have always kind of knew that I wanted to go, back to grad school and get my master's. And so when I was kind of in the research phases of that, I guess I kind of came back to it in a sense and was kind of like, oh yeah, graphic design, what does that look like? And how could that be like a career path? Is it something that I would be interested in? And so that's kind of where I guess came back to looking and considering graphic design, and then ended up doing my master's in web design. And so that's kind of, I guess, where those two paths kind of merged for me. And I really stepped into, being a designer myself.
I think it gives some hope and encouragement that like you don't have to have it all figured out to actually end up somewhere. So
yeah, I feel like, I mean, most of the designers, at least that, you know, I see on Instagram or that I know kind of come to design in a quote unquote traditional path, which is like you in undergrad, you get a bachelor's in art and you do like the whole art path. And that just wasn't, you know, the path that God had me on. I came to design more from like a business perspective, like from advertising and marketing and kind of more the business, I guess, side of things. And so I think for me, it's in the past, I think I've seen it as like a disadvantage or, you know, it's easy to fall into comparison and looking at other designers. But I think now that I've been doing it for a while, I think it really does give me a different perspective and a unique perspective, you know, in comparison to other designers who come to design from the art side who have equally unique strengths as well. But for me, I think I've kind of come to terms with I don't really consider myself as much as a graphic artist as I do like a visual communicator, just because I come to design from a different path, I guess.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really would love to hear you talk about just like what have been some of the internal challenges and struggles for you in like taking this path. And like you've already said, that mentioned comparison. But what's been hardest for you just in kind of getting going with some of this?
Gosh, I mean, I feel like I've kind of touched on a few things. So I guess like in the midst of like discovering design as a career and like kind of pursuing that path, I was just kind of in the midst of a lot of seasons of transition in my own life, while also kind of in that phase of like starting freelancing and considering starting my own business. And so just like navigating through those transitions in like my personal life with, you know, grad school and getting married and moving from one side of the country to the other to transitioning, you know, from working like a stable 9-to-5 job to freelancing full time and like then transitioning again from graduating and finishing grad school into teaching. And it's like in the midst of all that, I felt like I never really felt like I was ready or prepared enough or had enough experience to be transitioning into the roles that I was. So I think I struggled a lot, again, you know, like with comparison and looking at other designers and thinking that feeling of like I should be further along to be in the position that I'm in, and just really struggling with kind of like an imposter syndrome, with never really feeling like I was enough or I was ready enough to be, you know, in the roles that I was in, especially I struggled with comparison and still struggle with comparison as a designer, but I think with teaching it was like, well, again, I kind of came to teaching from a non-traditional path where I didn't study education in school. It was never my intent to be, you know, in education. And then I found myself wanting to share, you know, what I've learned as a designer with, you know, aspiring designers or aspiring creatives, and designers who were still in school, and like just having that desire in myself to share what I've learned and what I wish I would have known and what I wish someone would have told me when I was in their position. And so for me, that outlet just kind of organically came about in the way of teaching at a community college. And so I definitely did not feel like I was qualified to be in that role. And I definitely struggled a lot with just feeling like an imposter. Like I was like, I'm not an educator, but the reality is like I am, because I'm stand in front of a classroom and teach design. So that makes me, you know, an educator. And I think it's just, as a believer, I think it's important to remember that like God does not, you know, call people who are qualified or have the credentials or have the experience all the time. It's about like him qualifying you for the things that he's calling you and asking you to do. And so just being mindful of that, and reminding myself of like that truth instead of, you know, sometimes like the things that we feel, we kind of fall into comparison and feeling like, you know, we're not really equipped or ready or enough to be doing the things that we're doing.
Yeah, I know. What a lie, too, that
Mm-hmm.
you've got to have already reached the finish line to be capable or qualified to do what he's called you to do. And that's so not the case. And I wanted to ask just really practically, you said that comparison is still a bit of a struggle for you. And I'm curious, do you have any practices or things that you do to help you get out of that mindset when you are wrestling with comparison?
Yeah, I mean, the world that we live in today is like constantly scrolling Instagram, and you have so much access to be able to compare yourself, and like you have all these little windows into other people's lives. And I think it's just important to have perspective, and remembering that what you're seeing on Instagram, one, is like a highlight reel, and you're only seeing people sharing like the things that they're celebrating and like their strengths and the good things. And so it's important to remember that there's stuff that's happening on the other side of that everyone has struggles, and they're probably struggling with comparison and feeling like an imposter the same that I am. But another like really practical thing that I found, because it's just, as like someone who uses Instagram, like for my own business, it's just not practical for me to be like, oh, I'm just going to give up social media. And so instead of, having that perspective, I think for me, and a way that I'm kind of naturally wired is to be an encourager. So if I feel like, I'm following this designer and she posts like this beautiful work that she's done, and I feel like, wow, like she's so talented. I'm not like nearly as talented as her. Instead of falling into that, I'll like, comment something on her post that's encouraging and like uplifting of her. And so for me, like combating those feelings of comparison with actually like cheering that person on and encouraging them and what they're doing helps me to kind of give me some perspective, and like also reminds me of those things, like even though she's sharing this, she probably like rewrote her caption a million times and like doubted herself too, just like everyone else probably does. So even though it looks like, from an Instagram feed that everyone has it together, like remembering that those people need encouragement too, the same as, that you desire those things as well.
Absolutely. And she probably saw your comment and was like, oh, thank you so much. Like, I needed that today, or, that's great. What a great practice. I love that you do that. You shared with me a story about getting started in your business and design work, about a client that really shared some hard truths with you. I'd love it if you could talk about that, share that with the listeners too.
Yeah. I think, like you said, when some of the challenges when I was first starting out was really just learning how to do the business side of things and learning how to communicate with clients. And that's something that they don't teach you in school. You just kind of have to learn as you go, and figure things out, like as you're doing them sometimes. And for me, like early on, that was, something that I struggled with, and just kind of learning, the process of how to like manage projects and multiple projects and communicating with clients. And sometimes, things kind of fall through the cracks. And the story that I shared with you was one of my best client relationships that I have today. Just started out like it didn't start out well at all. Like it started off really rough, and there were some communication things, and that just kind of made the dynamic of like our relationship really stressful and caused some frustration. Some of that was external things that I just wasn't aware of and were totally out of my control. But there are also some ways that I, as like a designer who was just kind of starting out and figuring things out for herself, like I also kind of fell short in just like communicating things clearly and like just kind of delivering, what I said that I was going to deliver as a designer. And so I just remember that process being so scary and frustrating, and just that sinking feeling of like not living up to someone's expectations and letting someone down was just really, really a hard lesson. But thankfully, the client that I was working with was just gave me so much grace. And we ended up kind of having like a heart-to-heart phone conversation, during the process. And she pretty much told me like, look, I have a lot of love and respect for you, but, this, what we've come to at this point, like this isn't going to cut it basically, like this isn't enough for what I'm needing. And I, honestly like expect more. And, we need to kind of like figure something out and either come to a better solution or, kind of part ways. And so it was a really, really hard conversation. But it was definitely one that we needed to have. And it truly, like, if I didn't know the heart of the person, the client that I was working with, it would have been a different situation. But because I knew that it was coming from a good place and like her intent was really, to speak truth out of a place of love, even though it was like a really hard conversation to have. And so ultimately, I think the biggest lesson that I learned out of that was just kind of like owning the ways that, that I did fall short, and just communicating, that my heart was to genuinely like want the best for the client. And so in the end, like whether that was working with me or them finding someone else, like ultimately I wanted what was best for them. And so just kind of like owning that and giving, I think both of us giving each other grace in the process. Ultimately we ended up working it out. And today, like we've been working together for almost 3 years now. It's one of the best client relationships that I have. And it's funny because I was actually kind of reliving that this week with her. And we're just kind of laughing and thinking back of like how much things have changed and how grateful we are that we had that conversation and that we stuck it out. And, today we're still working together. And it's like the best and like the most amazing client relationship that I have. And so, and it's definitely some of the most fulfilling work that I get to do, because it's just an opportunity for me to really connect my faith with like the practical thing that I do with graphic design. And so all of that to say, I think it was a hard lesson for me to learn early on in like my career as a designer, but it's also just really, really valuable. And I think the biggest thing that I took away from it was just being real with clients and owning, like, if you mess something up or, you fall short, just owning that and being honest, and communicating that, like, ultimately my heart is to, help my clients and to do what's best for them. And so,
that's great.
I think I really learned, how to communicate with clients out of that and how to do a better job of that. And so it's something that I'm definitely a lot more mindful of today whenever I'm working, with someone new and kind of going through that stage of like getting to know a new client, and really like how to communicate well.
Yeah. Hard to learn starting out because you're like, oh my gosh, I need this to work. But so valuable in the long run for probably every client relationship that you have, that you're like, hey, I've made this mistake once. I'm going to get it right this time. Mm-hmm. And as you said, it built trust between you and the client because you guys were able to work it out. And that's huge. Yeah. I think it speaks a lot to, instead of avoiding hard things, just being willing to face them. And like you said, owning your part and moving forward if there's a way to do that. So awesome. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you've talked a lot about just, transition and kind of still being new to this business and obviously the things you're learning along the way. And I'd love to hear what verse of scripture has encouraged you in this season.
Kind of a scripture that I have been focusing on really all year, as I've been transitioning out of things that I was doing before like grad school and transitioning into teaching is really just focusing on God doing new things in the season of my life and focusing on, that it's Him that's making a way for things that I couldn't have even really anticipated. And so Isaiah 43, I think specifically the verse would be 43:19, but like really just that whole chapter of, that speaks to, God being the one that makes a way for us and that He's doing a new thing. And just being like mindful of that and even just like looking for the things that He's doing and the ways that He's working and like the doors that He's opened it's so obvious to me that like there's no way that I could have done, that on my own or, opened up a door, to start teaching. It's just a lot of the new things I think that I've transitioned into and stepped into, especially in this year with even just launching under my new name, Building 7. That's something that has been on my heart for years, and just finally stepping into that and trusting, that God's making a way, even when I can't see all the details or understand how everything's going to come together. Just learning to trust Him in that and stepping into new things and just trusting that like He's making a way for me, even when I can't see one or can't see really the way to move forward.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to read that verse too. I think it's so helpful to hear it straight from His word. So 43:19 says, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland." So I love that. I'd love to hear just the advice that you have for the listener out there who's either like where you've been, just kind of in seasons of transition, or knows she has a dream and isn't quite sure where to go next. Like, what would you say from what you've learned along the way?
I think, you just have to start. Like, you just have to start where you are and start with what you have. I feel like, that kind of seems something that's like oversaid, but it really is true. Like, don't let, comparison and, feeling like you have to have it all together. Like you said, like you have to be at the finish line before you can start. Like, if you really think about it, like that doesn't really make much sense. Like, everyone has to start somewhere. And so, just not letting that hold you back. And even if you only know like one next step, like do that thing. Because I think if you just start and you take action, like it's that action of like doing something that brings clarity for the next step. Or at least I feel like that's been the case for me. And just so like starting to take those small steps toward, what your goal is or what your dream is, and just doing the one next thing that you know to do. And then once you do that one thing, then like the next thing will become clear. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing, is just taking action and just starting where you are with what you have, and just doing the next thing. But I think another thing that's been just really helpful for me in my journey is seeking out wisdom and guidance from other people who are ahead of me, in whether it's in design or in business, or even just listening to podcasts like this, like seeking out wisdom and insight from others who are, doing the thing or doing something similar to what you want to do, and just learning everything that you can from, other people who have already done it.
Absolutely. I totally agree with both of those things. Well, I know you had something that you wanted to offer the listeners just to kind of support them. Can you tell us about your freebie on your website?
Yeah. So I created a freebie, or just kind of like it's like a to-do list, because I think, kind of on the note of like starting stuff and pursuing your dreams, that sometimes it feels like, we have all these things that we quote unquote have to do or have to get done. But I think something that's really been helpful for me is shifting my mindset from a place of like, I have to do this, to I get to do this. and thinking of it more from a perspective of gratitude, and being mindful of, again, like the ways that the doors that God is opening and the things that you get to do because he is making a way for you. And so I kind of, part of my routine, I guess, at the beginning of each week is I use the notes in my iPhone and just like list out all the things that I have to get done, or anything that needs, that I need to do that week. And so I kind of took that process for me, and like, I felt like I needed a tool to do that. That wasn't just like writing notes in my phone, something that was a little more structured than that. And so I kind of created it at first just for myself, to have something to print out and like write down like my brain dump of everything that I needed to get done. But then also trying to like train myself and help myself to think of, my to-do list in a different way. And really thinking of it from a perspective of gratitude, and thinking about, sorry, my dog's barking. Thinking about it from a perspective of like, I get to do this, not like I have to do this, or, thinking of it as like a burden, but more of as, like a blessing, that this is an opportunity that I get to step into and something that I get to do.
That's awesome. So we can find that.
So it'll be on my website. Yeah.
Okay. So building7.com, and I will put that in the show notes. That's awesome. Thank you. I love when you like create something for yourself and you're like, I think other people might need this too. Because absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I know you had a ton too of just like books and podcasts and other resources that have been helpful to you along the way. Could you just give us like your 90-second top favorite, narrow down however you can, list?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so important to just always, continue learning from other people. So I'm always like listening to a million podcasts and reading books. And so I think outside of like, obviously this podcast and just listening to other people share their journey, podcasts like, I love Business Boutique by Christy Wright. I think that one's just really practical. The Radiant podcast by Kelsey Chapman is really similar to this one, in that it's just like other people walking their journey and sharing their story. And then I really have been listening to pretty much anything Rachel Hollis lately. So the Rise podcast, and her book, Girl Wash Your Face, is amazing. I've listened to that on audiobook like 5 times. So those are probably like my top things.
Awesome. I'm so glad that we got to have this conversation today, and just to get to hear your story of starting out and having a lot of transition in your life. I mean, we didn't even get to talk about moving from Florida to Oregon. I'm sure that was hugely traumatic.
Yeah, that was a big transition.
Yeah, but at least you get to be with your husband, right? That's pretty important. Yeah. But I would just love to have you kind of close us out with a few thoughts on how you feel like, God using all of this in your life, how you've seen that, and how you feel like he's changed you in the process.
I think the whole journey, in pursuing design and kind of setting out on this path, I guess, has really just taught me surrender above anything else, and just trusting God with the details, really, and not trying to feel like I have to be in control, of everything or know everything before, I start something, and just trusting that God is in control ultimately of the outcome, and that he's directing my steps, as I move forward in the things that I feel like he is calling me towards. And so really, I think I've learned that it's more about just obedience, and trusting God versus me trying to control the outcome of, trying to feel like I have it all together or I know everything before I am willing to step out and take a risk or start something.
If you've ever felt you needed to achieve more before pursuing your dream, this was the episode for you. If you remember, Megan said she never felt ready or prepared enough to be in the roles she was in, but she was already there. And God has allowed her to be in those places of influence. He's made a way for her to use her gifting, and she said yes to the steps and opportunities right in front of her. She went on to talk about how she's dealt with comparison, and that's my first big takeaway from this interview. But before I do takeaways, I want to just acknowledge Colette, baby Colette, almost 4 months old, is sitting on my lap. So if you hear any squeaks or any jingles of her toy, that's what's going on in my world. Just wanted to give you a little bit of real life today. So anyway, takeaway number 1, that instead of giving into those thoughts or letting comparison tell her she's got no right to use her gifts in this way, she's decided to celebrate others who are doing great work. So why not give that a try this week? If you struggle with comparison, when you see someone whose good work sparks those feelings of inadequacy in you, why don't you try flipping it on its head? See what it feels like and how it changes your perspective if you were to make a concerted effort to celebrate her and encourage her instead of letting those feelings take you down. Takeaway number 2, Megan's path wasn't what she expected. So that means to me that you might not know where God is leading you. You might not know the finish line. So why not hold the details with open hands and take willing steps forward as He reveals them? And finally, takeaway number 3, it is okay to figure things out as you're working on them. And this kind of relates to the last one. If you don't really know exactly where you're headed, you might end up somewhere unexpected and you might not feel prepared. Which I guess connects us back to all 3 takeaways. But I bet you this happens more often than you think. This is exactly what I did when I started this podcast. I didn't know what I was doing. I just had to start and be put in a situation to have to figure those things out. And it's what Megan talked about with her client. And what mattered more than getting it right the first time was her character and her willingness to participate in the hard conversation that needed to happen. Then she took the feedback to heart instead of taking it personally and did the work to mend the relationship. So I'm really curious, what are your thoughts following this conversation? I would honestly love to hear them. You could come on over to the Devoted Dreamers Facebook group. That's a great place to have those conversations. We're talking about topics like these and cheering each other on towards our God-shaped dreams. Please come and join us. You'll just have to answer a few quick questions via the Facebook app, and then I will accept your request. You can share your thoughts about this week's show and join in the other conversations already going on there. Just look for us on Facebook in the Devoted Dreamers Insiders group. And I don't know if you were with us last season, but I had set a goal to get 50 reviews on iTunes before I went on maternity leave at the end of May. And boy, did you guys show up and do just that. We currently have 58 reviews, which blows my mind and is super humbling. If you haven't left a review yet, just click on ratings and reviews in the podcast app to share your thoughts about the show. Here's one. This one's from back in March, but it's from Tiff Thompson, entitled Inspiring. She says, this podcast is fantastic for inspiring us to go after our God-given dreams. Merritt is a fantastic host with a great voice, and I feel empowered every time I listen. Keep them coming. Tiffany, thank you so much for taking the time to review the show. Those words coming from a fellow podcast host mean the world to me. And friends, if you don't know Tiffany, she's host of the Tea of Life podcast about creating the life you love to live, whether that's making your life better through tips on parenting, boundaries, finances, daily routines, and more. Go check it out. You will find the show notes for this episode, as always, at merrittonsa.com/podcast/95. That's the episode number. There you can connect with Megan and find the link to her freebie, the to-do list focused on gratitude. Before we go, I also want to take a second to acknowledge the patrons of the Devoted Dreamers podcast, and especially Bree Uton, Cheryl McGrath, and Elizabeth Henry, who have contributed at the $20 or higher level. These ladies are known as my ultimate dreamers, and an even bigger deal is that Cheryl increased her contribution while I was on maternity leave. And get this, not a single patron at any level stopped giving while I was away. Ladies, I want to thank you so much for supporting my work, literally helping to pay my bills, even though I've been scaling back wherever I can so that I continue to do this work as long as possible. It means the world to me to have the monthly support from you all, and I so appreciate it. And if you'd like to get in on the chance to support the podcast and even be part of the quarterly Q&A coming up this fall with me and these 3 ultimate dreamers, that's one of the perks they get for giving at this level. Just visit patreon.com/Devoted Dreamers Podcast. That's patreon.com/Devoted Dreamers Podcast. That's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me back here for season 5. And as always, wherever you are with your God-shaped dreams, may you have the courage to take one step toward their realization today. I will see you next week.
Whoa.